So in the morning, it's going to be a bit of a double act between myself and Jonny here, covering off the deep dive into the reg. Before I start, what I should have said earlier as well is, for question, when we come to questions, you can absolutely put your hand up and we'll get someone to run gracefully over to you with a microphone. But also we have a Slido open. On your tables there is a QR code and a joining code for the Slido, so anyone who does want to join, the instructions are there, and you can type that either anonymously or leave your name as we go through if you have questions that come up. So before we go into it, what we're not going to do today is go absolutely over the entire MHHS design, because we'd need more than a day to do that, and then the impacts to the rec. But I am aware that we have different levels of familiarity with MHHS in the room, and people from different backgrounds. We've got people from the regulatory backgrounds, project management, IT, operations. We've got a nice blend in the room. So some will be more familiar than others with what's happening with MHHS and all of that. What I wanted to do, just as a bit of a scene setter, is to go back to the target operating model that was designed by Alexon, and underpins all of the design and what MHHS is transitioning to. And there are some terms that we'll go through today that really come back to this. What we've also got on your tables, for anyone who struggles with all of the acronyms, is we do have a little cheat sheet for the acronyms for you. So as we're saying our mop mem dip daps, you can reference those if you need to. The target operating model, there were some fundamental pieces that it brought in. And one is taking a step back from the agents that we have today and looking at what services do we need to make market-wide half-hourly settlement possible. And a lot of those align to what we have today. We need a metering service. We need someone to install the meters, maintain the details of those meters and pass those around the industry. That is the meter operator or the meter equipment manager, as we call it nowadays. And we have metering services that will do that there. That largely is UMEM. What it also does is it has a data service that is different to the way we do things today, because one of the things they change is aggregation isn't going to happen outside of settlements. Settlement data will go in a disaggregated manner, so there's no need for a data aggregator role to continue under the model. So you have a single data service for that. And then what they have is a split into market segments, rather than using measurement classes and such that we use today and profile classes to do this. The market will be divided up into 3 market segments, for smart and non-smart meters, for advanced meters, and for unmetered supplies. Jonny will go through that in a bit more detail later. So when we talk about those services combined with the market segments, and we talk about a smart data service, a smart metering service, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the data service, which ultimately replaces the kind of combined role of a data collector and data aggregator today, operating that segment of the market, the meter operator or the meter equipment manager operating in that segment of the market. There's a couple of new points to call out within particularly the smart data service. We have a meter reading service, which is what's sometimes referred to as a non-half-hourly data retriever today. That is just your meter readers. We're still going to need them. There's still going to be meters that need to be inspected, and you need to get a physical reading from. That will still exist. And then we also have a new role of a meter data retriever, or a smart meter data retriever, which we'll reference throughout that. What that basically does is allow a supplier's data service to become a DCC user and collect smart meter data on their behalf, to prevent the supplier having to ultimately send that data twice. So that's a new role that is optional on how suppliers use it. That will pick up there. So when we talk about a smart meter data retriever, we are talking about the new role that will operate where a smart data service can access the smart DCC to access smart meter data directly on behalf of the supplier. And then Jonny will cover off where we talk about the registration service. That is basically DNO's MPAS registration service, as it used to be known. It's referred to now as a ERDA or an SMRA, because we like changing terms for things, just to keep you on your toes. Jonny will talk through a bit more about there's some fundamental changes to the way that service will work to underpin all of that. And then all of this will be underpinned by a new event-driven architecture that will have a new messaging infrastructure that allows things to move in a more dynamic way. And again, Jonny will go through that. So I just wanted to cover that at a very high level, going back to basics. That's where it comes from. Some of the terms you'll hear through the day all get rooted back to and come from that underlying target operating model that came in a few years ago. Sid mentioned the timelines before. It's really just to flag up in terms of when we talk about this being around the corner. It is September this year the central systems go live, and those first participants who are going through systems integration testing are aiming to start migration in the October. There are also talks about can that be accelerated rather than pushed back at the moment. So even if you're not ready for MHHS in September, in October, you will start seeing the market moving. You will start seeing other suppliers migrating metering points to MHHS, and you will start seeing customers that you gain coming from potentially MHHS arrangements. So as we go through today, we're talking about there's two aspects of things. There's some things you're going to need to do and be ready for when MHHS goes live, regardless of when you qualify. Because things like accepting a reverse migrated MPAN into your portfolio, you have to be ready for that, even if you're not ready to start migrating MPANs. There are some other changes that will come up, and we'll try and call those out through the day. The final call out on the cheat sheet we've given you today is, it's a bit small on the printouts, so apologies, but we've given you a bit of a readiness checklist, and it's for guidance only, but you'll notice there are 3 sheets. One of them is about stuff you have to be ready for at Go Live September, regardless of when you qualify. Yeah? Because this stuff's going to happen, and you're going to need to have your operation ready to manage it. And then there's the stuff you need to do for when you qualify for MHHS. You know, but we thought it was really easy to call that, really, it's not easy, it's important to call out that distinction between the two, and hopefully make sure everyone leaves here with a very clear understanding of what that looks like. So that was that on that. I mentioned I'm not going through the end-to-end design, but I did want to signpost for anyone relatively new to this. On the MHHS programme website, there are some fairly useful walkthroughs of the design that have been recorded. The slides are available and the recordings are available. The caveat is they are from 2022, so changes since then, you'll need to have the health check that any changes that have been made since then, you do that. But for the most part, they still hold up. And for somebody coming in new, if you're just looking to really go to the basics and understand the design, I'd advocate going and doing that. So we've just included a bit of a signpost for anyone who wants that information for later. And before I hand over to Jonny, we're talking about changes to the rec here today, and there's what are the changes and what do they mean, but also in order for you to find them, you have to kind of understand the boring stuff a little bit of where have they come from and how do you find them. And so there's 3 main sources of where these changes have come from. Some have come from the MHHS design themselves. Alexon, as the implementation manager, were responsible for putting together the end-to-end design across codes required to implement the target operating model, and the majority of the changes came from that, yeah, and have been translated into that and raised through the rec change proposal that have implemented that through Ofgem significant code review. There were some that didn't come from that. Ultimately, an end-to-end design has to start and stop somewhere, and there were some bits where it didn't really impact the TOM, but by implementing that, it had wider impacts on some of the other bits in the rec. And some of that is things like changes to data flows. Some of it is some of the changes to the central services and all of that, and we'll cover all of that today. We put all of that into the same code drafting but the difference is that the design documents are slightly separate to where you find the MHHS design. And then we had some that we managed through separate reg change proposals, and those largely related to the stuff we needed to do with the central switching service, because there had to be a process that the MHHS design didn't really work for to go through that, and some changes to the supply number that's printed on bills that we're going to cover off a bit later as well. So we've just included this as a bit of a reference back to you guys. If you need to go back and find the different places it came from, there's 3 different places, and hopefully that can signpost you to the right place. But we're going to cover all of these today, and ultimately it's all going to come out as changes in the rec that you'll see for Go Live. That's it for me for now. I'll hand over to Jonny to start taking you through the detail.
Jonny, before you start, can I just interrupt? There's been one question on Slido about the materials for today, so that people that are scribbling frantically. Yes, the slide deck will be shared afterward. The session's also being recorded, so you'll be able to play back and access as well. Just thank you.
Morning all. Stole my thunder there, Elizabeth. I was going to just talk about that. So I'm going to go through the detail of the actual impacts to the rec and the process. There's quite a lot of it, as you may imagine, so apologies that it's me for a bit, and also there's a lot of topics. So as Elizabeth said, the slides will be shared. There's some colleagues behind taking a video, so you can run through it backwards and forward as you like. I won't be. So we'll go through the detail now. So the main impacts to the rec are caused by 4 main areas. The first one is the segmentation of the market, as John talked about. The market's been split into smart, advanced and metered segments. There's a creation of a dependency on the registration service, old MPAS being a central service, and that now runs and manages processes around meter technical details and also agent appointments. There's a number of data flows being replaced by new interfaces going through the DIP, and we'll talk about the DIP in more detail a little later. And the DIP also implements an event-driven architecture. So the majority of messages are now sent within 60 minutes, an hour, 2 hours between the trigger. So it means the data is being sent across the market and updated in really real near time. The exception to that is the SLAs around MTDs, but you've still got 3 working days to get across MTD updates. Okay, so I'll talk about the DIP. So the DIP, people have talked about it, you've heard the term. What is it? It's the data integration platform. So it's basically a messaging tool that allows messages to be sent across the market between market participants. Very similar to the data transfer network or the DTS currently managed by Electrolink. The main differences you'll see, I mean, there's a description there around it being a message-oriented, event-driven middleware components for all your technical people, but the main differences that the rest of us will see is that it's a service where a single message can be sent from a person sending a message in, and that message can then be subscribed to by multiple different people. So a single message can then be sent over to multiple different people. New messages will be created to be transferred over the DIP. We're looking at around 50 new market messages that are being implemented through the MHHS programme, and they can be found on the MHHS website in the DIP interface catalogue. In addition to that, there are some also BSC reports that are being sent over the DIP as well, and they're separate. These interfaces will be entered into the Energy Market Data Spec, the EMDS, which is held on the REC portal, and they'll be in there from milestone 8, which is in September 2025. So the DIP itself has been procured by the MHHS programme with a provider called Avanade, who have developed and implemented the solution, which is now going through test. Avanade are working with a partner called Global Sign, who are responsible for managing the security certificates, etc., for access into the DIP. So you may have seen, as you get more involved in MHHS, you might see more involvement with them parties, and that's who they are. Responsibility for the oversight and management of the DIP will pass to a new market provider called the DIP Manager, and that will happen at M10. Currently, the DIP is being managed by the MHHS programme. So the DIP Manager is the new organisation that's been tasked with delivery of the DIP, including its ongoing governance, funding and operation. Ofgem appointed Alexon as a DIP provider a few years back, and since then Alexon have been gradually taking over responsibility as a DIP provider, the DIP manager, sorry. Governance, the DIP rules went into governance in October last year, and they're held within the BSC, and you'll find them on the BSC digital code, and there's a link in the slides which we'll share. So what does that... Okay, and here's following that, there's a picture, very pretty picture of the architecture of the DIP. It's mainly calling out that an event producer will send an event into the event broker, which is then taken into there and it can be subscribed to by multiple different people, as we talked about before. So the impacts on rec parties. So rec parties, suppliers, MOPs, distributors will be required to prove their DIP connectivity as part of their MHHS qualification testing. So people going for MHHS qualification will need to evidence that they can use the DIP. This includes adherence to the DIP rules, which are contained in the BSC, with non-BSC parties such as meter operators that need to sign a DIP access agreement to use the DIP. Most interactions with SMRS, the registration service or MPAS, and Alexon Central Services, so the new settlement services, will be managed via DIP flows. This includes a number of rec processes, including the processes for the transfer of MTDs, the change of energisation status, and the appointment of agents, including meter operators, which will all be managed via DIP flows. So just moving on onto the impact of the market segments. So as we talked about before, there's 3 new market segments. The market segment, as John said, replaces the measurement class, and profile class is also not used to define a market segment anymore. The smart segment, the market segments are based on the actual meter installed on the site. So the smart segment will be metering points that have a smart or traditional meter installed. The advanced segment will be advanced meters, and the meter segment will be UMS sites. Where a combination of meters are installed, so sites where you've got a traditional meter and advanced meter, for example, on the same MPAN, they will move into the advanced segment. MHHS itself doesn't impact the actual physical metering activities. However, they are impact on the upstream processes for meter operators around transfer of MTDs, etc., which are slightly different for each market segment. As such, meter operators need to qualify either as a smart meter operator or an advanced meter operator, or both, to be able to work in the market. So moving on, we've talked about the registration service being a more central party to the TOM. So as I said, the MHHS design includes a central role for the registration service. So when we talk about the registration service, this covers a service currently operated by the ERDS and the SMRS. So the ERDS is the Electricity Retail Data Service, which is governed by the REC, and SMRS is the Supplier Meter Registration Service governed by the BSC. The main changes we're seeing for MHHS affect the SMRS, which is the BSC part of the registration service. So most of the rules and requirements for the registration service from an MHHS point of view are now held within the BSC and will be part of the new BSCP. We don't see much impact at all on the REC-governed ERDS, apart from the requirements currently in the ERDS to update the inquiry service, the EES, better known as ECHOs, will move from the ERDS SMRS. So these requirements to update the inquiry service will now be held in the BSC. So the main impact of REC processes on the registration service, which we will go through in detail in a minute, are the management of MTDs, which will be centralised within the registration service, the appointment of agents, which are now centralised with the registration service, and also the updates to energisation statuses, which will now be managed by meter operators and also centralised within the registration service. Okay, talking about these processes, we'll just look at them in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the meter change process, currently, to change a meter, a supplier would send a 142 to a meter operator. the meter operator would do the work and send out the MTDs or the updates based on D4s. So they'd send a 268 to update half-hourly MTDs or 14950 to update non-half-hourly MTDs. They'd also send a D10 to share the register readings after they've done the change. Similarly, for energisation statuses, you send a D flow to request the change, and a D139 will come back to tell you that it had changed. In the MHHS world, this is changing. So the existing DTN messages will be retained for requesting the work. So you'd still send a 142, you'd still send a 134. However, there will now be new DIP messages from SMRS to share some of that information. So the MOP would send an IFO 5 to update SMRS, and SMRS would then send, meeting service would send a IFO 6 out to update all parties. For advanced and traditional meters, because SMRS doesn't contain all the information held within the traditional data flows, the 268 is being retained for advanced, and the 149-150 is being retained for traditional. So you send these flows as well as the updates to SMRS. So as I said before, the physical metering updates are unchanged, so there is no material change to be identified to the ComCop. So therefore, we're not required, there's no requirement for MOAs to undergo any additional accreditation checks other than the qualification they do for MHHS. As I said, for smart meters, all the information is now held in SMRS. So for smart meters, you won't get the traditional 149-150, you'll just get a single message from SMRS detailing the metering technical information. To point out, unlike where we are now, where you can update the energisation status via 149-150, that will not be the case anymore, and separate notifications will need to be sent for energisation status changes, which is the IFO 7 and the IFO 8. Going into the next level down on that and basically repeating what I've just said, but I think it's important because this is one of the real changes. For a meter installed exchange remove, a person would send, the supplier would send a 142 to request it. The meter operator would then send the MTDs into the SMRS registration service via an IFO 5 to update the central records. The registration service would then send an IFO 6 out to all interested parties, which include the supplier, the DNO and the data service. Again, the 268 is retained for advanced, the 149-150 is retained for traditional meters. And energisation status change, 134 still retained, that still goes out. That goes into the MOA. The MOA would then update the registration service via the IFO 7, so that's instead of that going to the supplier, and there's no 205 for supplier to send the registration service. The registration service will then send an IFO 8 out to the interested parties, which are the supplier, DNOs and data service. It's a key point that isn't actually contained on the slide, is that for any energisation statuses managed by the DNO, the process is similar. So DNO would do the update based on the 134. They would then need to tell the MOA via 139, and the MOA would still need to update the SMRS. So in all instances, even if the DNO has done the update, it's the meter operator's job to update SMRS. For both activities, we're still sharing meter readings. So cumulative meter readings shared via the DIP, via the IFO 41, and where we're using meter register readings for advanced and traditional meters, you would still use a D10. Moving on, the other thing we talked about has been a big change to the process is the supplier agent appointment process. So some agents are generally appointed via the registration process or just a general change of agent in mid-flight. This is normally done today via bilateral communication. Supplier would send a 155 or 153 to the agent send the 11 back, and then supplier would update MPRS via 205. That's changing with the registration service now the central manager of that process. So in the MHHS world, the supplier has now an obligation to initiate the appointment where initial registration switch is pending within 60 minutes of that. And as I said, the agent appointment is managed by SMRS. So the supplier would send a flow into SMRS to appoint the agents. SMRS would then send the flows out to the parties to say, do you want to be the agent? Manage that process, and then tell the supplier and the agents when the appointment had gone live. For smart meters, the MTDs will be shared via that appointment process. So the actual appointment flow, the IF36, will include the MTDs as part of the appointment. We have implemented a REC consequential change around traditional metering to use a T170 to make sure there's a means to request missing MTDs for losing MOA, because that wasn't part of the initial design. Where a supplier agent appointment has not been established within SMRS, the registration service will send out an error message, IF45, which will go out to suppliers to tell them there was a gap within the agent appointments. That message will go out every 7 days saying, please appoint an agent. Within the REC, we will be using that message as part of performance assurance to monitor that agents are being appointed correctly for MPANs. Just to give a pictorial description of that process, so including all the data flows. So in the new world, for example, in a MOP appointment, an MOA appointment, the supplier requests the MOA is appointed via the IF31. SMRS will then validate that request and accept the request via an IF32 and send the request over to the MOA via the IF33. The MOA will review that and either accept or reject. Assuming they accept it, they'll send the IF34 back to SMRS, and SMRS will confirm the appointment has been accepted via IF35 to both the supplier and the MOP. That will then be held within SMRS until the appointment goes live, either when the registration goes live or when the actual agent appointment goes live. At that point, SMRS will issue the notification to the supplier agents, DNO, and also EAS via the IF36. And that is your acknowledgement that that agent is now appointed. They'll also issue a de-appointment notification to the supplier, the losing agent, the DNO, and also EAS to terminate the appointment within EAS. For prospective appointments, SMRS will revalidate the appointment request for the day following gate closure, the day before the appointment goes live, just to make sure that the requesting supplier is still the supplier. So that means that any supplier, any appointment would be lapsed if the supplier then left that relationship. So moving on, still around sort of the agent appointment process, but looking at related metering points in particular. So currently, a related metering point affects supplier registration. So it means that if you've got related MPANs, they are auto-registered together, with the primary point being moved and the secondary point being auto-switched within CSS. That situation is retained within MHHS. However, it's expanded on slightly to also apply to the supplier agent appointments. So the MOA and the data service appointments will be progressed together in relation to the primary MPAN. So if you change the appointments on the primary related MPAN, it will also change the appointments on the secondary related MPANs. In addition to that, the actual means of relating an MPAN is changing. There's now a new DIP message to do that. So you send an IF19 into SMRS to relate an MPAN, and the acceptance message will be an IF20 coming back. And just to reiterate, any change to changes to relationships, that's the word, will impact the appointments. So if you change your relationship or either create one or split one, that may affect the appointments of the affected MPANs. So if the supplier is doing that, they should be well aware of that change and monitor it. We have had some additional consequential change which has been progressed because currently the relationships are managed as a half-hourly relationship or a non-half-hour relationship, with a half-hour relationship being around dual tariff relationships and the non-half-hour relationship being around the metering. As them words no longer exist, there's no such thing as non-half-hourly, half-hourly, that's now being changed to now define the relationship as a whole current relationship or a current transforming relationship. And then similarly with the import and export associations, currently an import and export association is held in SMRS, and there's an existing requirement to maintain the agents, however there is no automation within the system to maintain the agent appointments. In the new world, import and export metering points can still be registered by different suppliers. However, a mechanism has been introduced to maintain the meter operator appointment across the relationship. For advanced meters, a data service appointment will also be retained across the relationship. So if you appoint a meter operator for an import MPAN, that meter operator will automatically be appointed on the export MPAN, even if you're not the supplier for that MPAN. So again, suppliers will need to monitor that because they may find their export agents being changed by activity done by a supplier that's not theirs. It's not them. Again, the DIP messages, the IF19 and the IF20, will be used to create import-export associations. Yes, and then just point out that it will be automatically appointed. With the appointment notification, just to confirm, they will be issued to both suppliers. So if a import supplier changes the meter operator, the export supplier will get the appointment notification flow through to let them know that has happened. And again, just to reiterate, any change to an import-export association could impact how the agents are appointed. And again, monitor that. If you're changing that, you may see some changes to your agent appointments through that process. And I think I'm going to hand back over to John. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This last bit before we go and have a break and get some teas and coffees and such, I'm just going to talk a little bit about impacts to switching from MHHS. And I suppose the first point is, from a market participant perspective, there's not a lot of it, which is a good thing for you guys. There are some changes that impact the CSS directly. There are more impacts to DNOs for their interfaces through their ERDA service that they operate with the CSS. But largely it is to do with the kind of messaging and the sequencing there. For the switch process itself, nothing is changing in terms of how you submit a switch request or an initial registration request to the CSS. You will still submit the same message to the CSS, and you will get the same messages back from the CSS in relation to objection periods and confirming the various statuses of that switch up until that switch being secured at 5 p.m. before the date of the switch. What will change is currently today when you switch supplier, the new supplier will get a D217 and a D260 with the information that they need for that from the relevant MPAS service, and that will change. What will happen is you will receive DIP interface 2 for that switch at the point that the switch is pending with the information that you need to take that forward, and at the point that the switch is secured you will receive a DIP interface 1 with the information there needed, and that will be used to update all of the various actors outside of the supplier as well to confirm that that switch has gone ahead. So the key difference there is that replacement of the 217 and the 260 when it's an MHHS migrated metering point, you will receive those DIP messages instead and need to update your processes to accommodate that. We mentioned smart meter data retrievers earlier. So this is something where when you appoint your agents, your smart data service using the process Jonny talked through, you will either notify them of a specific meter data retriever you want to work with, or by default it will be the data service. A supplier can also choose to be their own data service if they say that they don't want their agent to do that on their behalf and they want to collect the data and pass it on. They can put themselves down and there's a process for that. The key thing from a switching perspective here is that there needs to be a way of the smart DCC knowing who the meter data retriever is, because you don't just want anyone coming and saying it's okay, I can nick all your customers' data. So there is a process whereby where you appoint that agent and you notify it through the ERDA, the MPAS service for that DNO, they then pass that information through to the central switching service, who then route that through to the smart DSP service, which is the service operated by CGI for the DCC in relation to that. And when an authorised DCC user in that role sends the request to set up those schedules and receive that information, the smart DSP will validate that it's the right MDR based on what's been notified from the ERDA. Operationally, what that means is if your MDR comes to you and says it's telling me I'm not the MDR, what you need to do is look at who have you notified through that message to the ERDA, has that completed successfully, and if you have, has something gone wrong somewhere down the chain. So that's what that means, essentially. Outside of that, the main impacts are, as I say, the changes to those messages and the sequencing of those messages between the ERDA and the CSS and what you get back from the ERDA. The other things that have changed are around switch transfer readings. So at the moment there is a process whereby for non-half-hourly supplies a transfer read, a COS read, there's quite a few different terms people use for it, is agreed between the relevant data collectors and passed on to the suppliers. And there is an option where that read is missing or that read isn't agreed for that to be disputed and to be amended through a process set out in the REC. That is changing to some extent based on what's happening there, and I'll cover that off just now. So, today we have an exception process that applies, as set out in the REC, only to non-half-hourly supplies. Well, we've had to review that because non-half-hourly isn't going to exist anymore, and look at that. And what is changing is that the process will apply to all metering points. So if you're a supplier today or an agent today that operates solely in half-hourly and historically hasn't had to worry about these processes, it's something that would apply to you come MHHS that you'll need to start looking at. So that's the first thing. The scope of who's involved in the process has changed. The second is around, at the moment, you have different trigger points for when this kicks in. You have one for smart meters and one for non-smart meters. So you have a little bit longer for non-smart meters to trigger the process for chasing missing readings or disputing readings. That's all being standardised, and we're going to have a standardised process window there. 10 working days for all metering points. If something's missing or something's not right, that can all be kicked off. And then in terms of what's happening with the meter readings itself, in line with those market segments and the different things that are happening with the meters, the way the switch meter reading is agreed has changed. For traditional meters, for non-smart traditional meters where, as Jonny said, you'll still have a D150 and a D149 in the way that we do today, the meter reading will be agreed as it is today for the switch, which will be based on the active register readings used for settlements. Yeah. So if you have a day-night meter, you will agree a reading for the day and you'll agree a reading for the night, and that will be that. For smart meters, there is a change where, regardless of whether the time of use tariff is in operation for that smart meter, the switch meter reading will only be the cumulative meter reading, the total reading. So it doesn't matter if there's 1 register, 2 registers, 3 registers, 4. Yeah. When you switch supplier, the meter reading you agree will always be that total cumulative reading. Yeah. And that's quite an important one to make sure everyone's operating to the same point on. That means by default, if you are disputing a meter reading, it should always be based on the total cumulative meter reading, which can, for smart meters, be separate. If you just have one meter reading register active, that won't necessarily always be the same reading as the total. So that's the key thing that's changing with that process to be aware of. There's some underlying points with that where, because of some of the way that the process is changing for MHHS, previously, when you agreed a meter reading, the supplier would send the confirmed meter reading to the data collector through a D300. That's not being retained, and so you won't be sending a D300 to the data service to correct it. Instead, what's been done is we've introduced a new meter reading type in the D10. So you would send a D10, but there would be a new type that you would use to let the data service know that that is an agreed reading that needs to be updated. So that's the main changes with the exception process for people to be aware of. And I'm mindful that's all quite difficult to get in a line. So if there are, when we get to the questions, if there are things people want to follow up or clarify with that, we can pick all of that up. That is that before we take a coffee. If anyone did have any questions now, we've got some time to answer any of them.
On the back of the registration process, you said 260, 270 in place. What about a new connection? You just get 217, you still get the dip there?
You will still get the dip though on a new connection, yes. But yeah, obviously you don't get the 260 today on the new connection. Yeah.
To get the
There you go. Elizabeth's the most graceful. She'll run with the mic.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So with the Import-Export Associations and the registration service auto-appointing the MOA, does it do the same for the data service or is it just the MOA?
Sorry, I was trying to get the mic, but we can repeat the question, please.
Yeah, of course. So Import-Export Associations, so the registration service will auto-appoint the MOA from the import. Does it do the same for the data service or is it just the MOA?
It will for advanced.
Okay, so
So
advanced it does the data
smart-
service, but smart it doesn't.
Smart, you can separate them.
Okay,
But for advanced, you've got to keep the same data service. It will do for advanced.
okay. Thanks for confirming.
Any other questions or? No? Okay, in which case we could take a break. Teas and coffees will be in the room downstairs where people had that before. And we'll come back here for about 25 past.